The town of Cedar Ridge, California was starving. 60 days, 60 days without a single supply train crossing the Sierra Nevada. The pass was buried under 30 feet of snow. The iron bridge over the American River had collapsed in a landslide back in January. And the men in San Francisco who printed the railroad schedules had never spent a winter at 7,000 feet. By March of 1889, the flour was gone. The salt pork was gone. Old Ephraim, the retired lumberman, was found frozen in his cabin with a full wood pile and an empty larder. The Whitcomb baby slipped away on a Tuesday night while her mother hummed a lullaby she could barely remember the words to. Cyrus Hollingsworth stood behind the counter of his empty mercantile watching the town he had ruled for 20 years turn thin and quiet. For 4 years, this same town had called one woman mad. The widow on the hillside, the one with the shed. They had laughed at her drying frames and her cheesecloth and her endless patience with wild fruit that nobody else bothered to pick. And now up on the hillside east of town in a long, narrow shed with slatted walls and a cedar shake roof, that woman opened a door. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling, sealed in cloth sacks in wooden boxes, sat 520 pounds of dried fruit. 4 years of patient labor. 4 years of being called mad. She turned to her 11-year-old daughter and said quietly, "Winona, hitch up Bramble, it's time." The wagon came up the Cedar Ridge Road on a Tuesday in September of 1884, and nobody in town paid it much attention. Wagons came through every week. Timber families heading west, miners heading east, preachers heading nowhere in particular. The road ran from Sacramento up into the Sierra Nevada like a thin brown thread stitched across the pine slopes, and Cedar Ridge sat right in the middle of it. A lumber town, 240 souls, one general store, one church, one saloon, one sawmill that ran 6 days a week and closed on Sunday because Josiah Pembroke said God expected it. The wagon that arrived that Tuesday was pulled by a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her nose. The mare's name was Bramble. On the wagon seat sat a woman in a black wool coat, and beside her sat a small girl in a blue dress. And under the seat, curled into a tight black ball that quivered whenever the wagon jolted, lay a dog. Coal black, ears half-cocked, watching everything. The woman pulled the mare to a stop in front of the mercantile. She did not go inside. She sat there for a long moment, looking at the town, looking at the sky, looking at the way the afternoon light struck the slope of hills east of town, where the pines gave way to open meadow and the meadow gave way to rocky outcrops that caught the sun and held it. "Mama," the little girl said, "is this it?" "This is it, Winona. It's small. Small is good. Why, Sfam? Because small towns forget you faster." Winona thought about that. Then she nodded like it made perfect sense, which it did to her, because she was 7 years old and her mother had never once said a thing that didn't make sense, and Winona was not about to start doubting her now. Her name was Mabel Ashcroft. She was 47 years old. Her hair was the color of iron filings, and she wore it pulled back so tight it made her forehead look severe. Her hands were red at the knuckles. Her eyes were gray, and she had buried her husband 5 months earlier in a churchyard 300 miles south of Cedar Ridge, and she did not intend to bury anyone else. Thaddeus had been a lumberman. He had spent 22 years walking around under trees that could kill him, and he had believed the way lumbermen believed that the tree that would kill him had not yet grown. He was wrong. It had grown. It was a Douglas fir on a slope above the Merced, and when it came down, it took Thaddeus with it, and the foreman drove out to the house that evening with an envelope containing $200 and an expression that suggested he hoped Mabel would not make trouble. Mabel had not made trouble. She had made plans. She sat now in the wagon in front of the mercantile at Cedar Ridge, and she thought about the plans. She had been thinking about them for 5 months. She had thought about them while she washed Thaddeus's shirts one last time. She had thought about them while she packed her mother's cedar chest. She had thought about them while she signed the papers that sold the house in Placerville for $180 and change. She had thought about them all the way up the mountain road with Winona sleeping against her shoulder and Coley snoring at her feet. The plans were simple. Find a hillside, build a shed, fill the shed with what her mother had taught her, and what her mother's mother had taught her mother, and what the whole long line of women behind her stretching back to a homestead in the hill country of Tennessee, where preserving food had not been a hobby, but a matter of whether the children saw spring. Mabel climbed down from the wagon. "Stay," she told Winona, with Coley. The girl nodded. The dog thumped his tail once. Mabel walked into the mercantile. The bell above the door made a small tin sound. Cyrus Hollingsworth was behind the counter. He was a stout man, red beard shot with silver, small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. He looked up from the ledger he was working on, and he took in Mabel Ashcroft the way a man takes in a stranger. Quickly, head to foot, filing her away. Widow, he decided. The black coat gave it away. Poor, he decided next. The coat was mended at the elbow. Not from here, he decided last. He knew every face in Cedar Ridge, and hers was not one of them. Help you, ma'am. I'm looking to buy land. Cyrus set down his pen. Land. 5 acres, maybe more. Hillside, east-facing if I can get it. East-facing hillsides around here aren't good for much. Too steep for grazing, too rocky for planting. I know. He waited for her to say more. She did not say more. May I ask what you want it for? Drying fruit. Cyrus blinked. I'm sorry, drying fruit. Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then a small smile began at one corner of his mouth. He tried to hide it. He was not entirely successful. Mrs. Ashcroft. Mrs. Ashcroft, I stock dried fruit here. Comes up from Sacramento by rail. Proper packaging, proper labels. Folks around here. I'm not looking to compete with you, Mr. Hollingsworth. He noticed she had used his name, which he had not given her, which meant she had asked someone about him before she came in, which meant she had planned this stop. The small smile went away. There's a fellow name of Ezra Hollingsworth, owns some acreage east of town, he said carefully. That's my cousin. Might have some parcels for sale. Steep ground, though, not much good for anything. That will do. Mrs. Ashcroft, I don't mean to pry, but a woman alone. I'm not alone. You have a daughter. Ah, and a horse and a dog. Cyrus opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he looked past her through the front window at the wagon in the street, at the small girl on the seat, at the black dog watching him through the grass with an expression that was not quite friendly. I'll fetch Ezra, Cyrus said. Ezra Hollingsworth was a thinner, meaner version of his cousin. He came into the mercantile 10 minutes later with the walk of a man who thought he was about to swindle a widow, which he was, which was fine with him. He had 5 acres of what he called Scrub Hill east of town. Steep, rocky, a little scrub oak, a little wild grass, utterly unfit for farming. He had been trying to unload it for 6 years. He would take $30 for it and consider himself lucky. $30, he said in a tone suggesting deep sacrifice. I'll take it, Mabel said. Ezra had paired several counter-arguments in case she tried to bargain him down to 20. He had to swallow all of them at once. His face reddened slightly. You don't want to see it first. I saw it coming up the road. Utah, the parcel east of the creek, above the switchback, with the old apple trees at the top. Ezra stared at her. Cyrus stared at her. How did you point? So, I have a good eye for land, Mr. Hollingsworth. Have the papers drawn up. I'll pay cash. She counted out $30 on the counter, 6 $5 coins, set them down in a neat stack, turned around and walked out. The bell over the door made its little tin sound. Ezra and Cyrus stood looking at the coins. Well, Ezra said finally, that was easier than I thought. Cyrus was still looking out the window. The wagon was already turning, the chestnut mare stepping careful, the little girl waving at the black dog. The widow was not looking back at the store at all. She was looking up the hillside, at the trees Ezra had just sold her. And there was something in her face that Cyrus did not entirely like. Ezra, he said, yeah, how did she know about the apple trees? Ezra thought about it. I don't know. Nobody knows about those apple trees, Ezra. They're back off the road, in the scrub. I don't know how she knew. Cyrus was quiet a moment longer. She's from the valley, he said finally. You can tell by her hands. Fruit country, Sacramento or thereabouts. So nothing, Cyrus said, but he kept watching the wagon until it disappeared up the switchback, because there was something about the widow that unsettled him. And Cyrus Hollingsworth was a man who liked to know why he was unsettled. It made him feel in control. He would not be in control much longer. But he did not know that yet. She built the shed before she built the house. This was the first thing that got talked about. It got talked about at the mercantile. It got talked about at the mill. It got talked about at the church and at the saloon, And at Adelaide Pembroke's Wednesday afternoon quilting circle, which was less about quilting than about the systematic evaluation of everyone in Cedar Ridge who was not present. She built the shed first, Adelaide said, threading a needle. Before the house, before the house. Where is she living then? In the shed, with the child, with the child. And the animals. The horse has her own lean-to. The dog sleeps with the child. Merciful heavens. That is what I said. Adelaide Pembroke was 52 years old. She was the wife of Josiah Pembroke, who owned the tailor shop in the mill and half the buildings on the main street. Adelaide had a long face and a longer memory, and she did not approve of eccentricity in women. Eccentricity in women, she had decided long ago, was a slippery slope. It began with building sheds before houses. It ended with turning up at church in trousers. Someone should speak to her, said Prudence Hollingsworth, who was Cyrus's wife. A soft woman, round face, kind eyes she tried to hide. Someone will, Adelaide said. But nobody did, not right away, because the widow, whatever else she was not the sort of woman you spoke to lightly. She had come into town twice in the first 3 weeks, once for nails, once for cedar shakes. Both times she had counted out her money. Both times she had said thank you. Both times she had left without saying anything else at all. You could not gossip at a woman who did not stay long enough to be gossiped at. So the town watched her from a distance. The shed went up in 11 days, 24 feet long, 10 feet wide, slatted walls that let the air pass through, cedar shake roof, a small stone hearth at one end for the wet days. Racks at 3 levels waist-shoulder overhead, fitted with wooden frames strung with cheesecloth, pulled tight at his drum skin. Then, and only then, did she start on the cabin. The cabin was smaller than the shed. This was the second thing that got talked about. By the time the first snow came in November, the cabin was up. 1 room, sleeping loft, fieldstone hearth, a covered porch that faced east and caught the morning light. Bramble's lean-to was tucked against the north wall, snug and dry. Coley had a rag rug by the door. Winona had a small bed in the loft with a blue quilt her grandmother had made in 1859. Mabel had a ledger. Every night she wrote in it, pounds harvested, pounds processed, pounds stored, weather, wind direction, notes on which frames dried faster than others, notes on which fruit came from which slope, notes on which trees in the abandoned orchard on the ridge produced apples worth taking and which trees were too far gone. She wrote in the ledger by the light of a single candle. Winona sat across from her at the table reading a primer. Mama. Mrs. Ellery says my dress is old-fashioned. Your dress is warm. She says her mother says the dye is out of style. Is it warm? Yes. Then it isn't out of style. Winona chewed her lip. Coley sighed heavily from his rag rug. The candle guttered and steadied. Mama. She said other things, too. Mabel set down her pen. She looked at her daughter across the table. Her daughter's face was very small in the candlelight. Her daughter's eyes were her father's eyes, and Mabel felt the old ache come up under her breastbone, the way it always did when she was tired, and she pushed it down the way she always did. What things? About us. Say them. Winona swallowed. She said we live in the shed. She said the shed is for mad women. She said her mother said you were driven mad by Papa dying, and that's why we came here. She said, Winona's voice caught. She said the whole town knows. Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up. Get your coat. Where are we going? Outside. It's snowing, Mama. Get your coat. They went out into the snow. Coley came with them because Coley went where Winona went. The 3 of them walked up the slope behind the cabin, past the shed, past the stump of the old pine Mabel had cleared in October. They walked until they came to the fence line at the top of the property where the abandoned orchard began. 6 apple trees stood there in the snow. Old trees, gnarled, half forgotten. Nobody had pruned them in 20 years. Nobody had picked from them in almost as long. They had stood on that hillside through fires and droughts and one bad winter in 1879, when the snow broke the branch off the biggest one and the tree had grown around the wound and gone right on bearing. Winona. Yes, Mama. Look at those trees, the girl looked. Tell me what you see. Apple trees. What else? They're old. What else? Winona thought hard. Nobody takes care of them. That's right. But the girl looked closer, but they still had apples. This year we picked from them. That's right. Mabel crouched down in the snow beside her daughter. She was still much taller than Winona even crouched. She put one red-knuckled hand on the girl's shoulder. Winona, do those trees care what anybody says about them? No, Mama. Do they care that nobody prunes them? No, Mama. Do they care that people walk right past them and don't even see them? No, Mama. What do they do? Winona was quiet a moment. They make apples. That's right. Every year. Every year. The snow was coming down harder now. Coley shook it off his coat and sat down heavily beside Winona and leaned against her leg. The girl put her mittened hand on the dog's head. Mama. Yes. Are we the apple trees? Mabel almost smiled. She did not entirely because she was not a woman who smiled often, but her chest moved in a way that was very close to it. We are the apple trees, baby. Then I don't have to care what Mrs. Ellery's girl says. You do not, because I just have to make apples. You just have to make apples. Winona nodded slowly. The snow was catching on her eyelashes. She looked up at her mother and her face was very serious, the way 7-year-old faces get when they have understood something they will not forget for the rest of their lives. Mama. Yes. What are our apples? Mabel looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she looked at the shed on the slope below them, dark against the snow. Then she stood up and took her daughter's mittened hand in her red-knuckled one. Come on, she said. I'll show you. She was 10 years old before she understood everything her mother had built. Not the shed exactly. The shed she had understood from the first winter. The shed was where the fruit went. The shed was where the racks slid in and out like drawers. The shed was where the cheesecloth got washed every spring and hung on the line to dry in the sun. But the whole thing, the reason, the pattern, that took until 1887. By 1887, the operation had grown. There were 40 apple trees now on the property saplings Mabel had put in the first spring and second spring and third spring, and though most of them were still too young to bear, 4 of the oldest were beginning to come into their own. There were pear trees along the south fence. There were plum trees in the swale where the frost pooled last, in spring and first in fall. There were blackberry canes on trellises Mabel had built out of scrap lumber from the mill canes trained east and west to catch the maximum sun. And there were the wild patches, the huckleberry meadows Mabel had negotiated access to with 2 hill families up the valley, the Krebs and the Austenbergs, in exchange for finished dried fruit at fair rates. The blackberry thickets choking every abandoned homestead within 4 miles. The wild plum stands along Cedar Creek. The neglected orchards of the first settlers' orchards that nobody had thought to harvest in a decade, orchards that dropped their fruit to rot on the ground every autumn, while the town of Cedar Ridge ate tinned peaches from Sacramento. Winona helped with all of it. By the time she was 10, she could slice an apple to a 1/4-inch thickness without measuring. She could tell a ripe pear from an underripe one by the smell alone. She could load a drying frame in the pattern her mother taught her pieces just close enough to fit, but never touching air moving between them. She had also learned something else. She had learned that the town was watching them, not kindly. There was a phrase now in Cedar Ridge. Adelaide Pembroke had coined it, and Adelaide's phrases stuck. The phrase was the widow's madhouse. It was used to describe the shed. It was used to describe the whole property. It was used sometimes to describe Mabel Ashcroft herself. It was used most of all by the children in the schoolyard who had heard their mothers use it and who did not yet understand that some words were sharper than they looked. Winona heard it every school day. She did not cry about it anymore. She had learned from that night in the snow when she was 7 that apple trees do not cry. Apple trees make apples. So Winona made apples. She ran errands after school. She fed Coley. She brushed bramble. She washed cheesecloth in the wooden trough behind the cabin, her small red hands red from the cold water. She counted dried plums into cloth sacks. She learned to write labels in a careful round hand. Plums autumn, 1886, pears summer, 1887. And she learned to write the date in the corner in Roman numerals because that was how her grandmother had done it, and Mabel said tradition mattered. She was by any measure a happy child. She just did not have friends, Mabel noticed. Mabel did not say anything about it. Because what was there to say the town would come around or the town would not? In her experience, the town always came around eventually. It just took a while. And in the meantime, the shed was filling. By the summer of 1887, there were 320 pounds of dried fruit on the storage shelves in the cool cellar Mabel had dug into the hillside behind the cabin. Apples, pears, plums, cherries both sweet and sour, blackberries pressed into small, dense cakes wrapped in wax cloth, huckleberries in sealed wooden boxes. There was smoked venison from the Krebs family. There was salted trout from Cedar Creek. There was a growing rack of pemmican Mabel had learned to make from an old trapper up the valley who had been running lines in the Sierra since before the war. 320 pounds, enough for a woman and a girl to eat for 2 years. More than enough. Mabel kept adding to it, and every so often when she walked into town for nails, or thread, or salt, she caught Cyrus Hollingsworth watching her from the counter of his mercantile with that same unsettled look he had worn the day he first met her. The storm came on the night of October 17th, 1887. It came out of the west off of the Pacific, a warm, wet wind. The old-timers called a chinook, and it hit the Sierra crest hard. Trees came down in the forest above the property. The old barn at the Whitcomb place lost half its roof. Down in town, Josiah Pembroke's tailor shop lost a shutter, and Cyrus Hollingsworth Mercantile lost the sign over the front door, which sailed off into the dark and was never found. Up on the hillside, the wind found the shed. Mabel was already asleep when it hit. She woke up because Coley was standing on her chest, growling low in his throat. Winona was sitting up in the loft listening. The wind was making a sound Mabel had not heard since her mother's house in a bad winter in 1858, a sound like a train coming through the trees. "Mama, get your boots." The shed, "Get your boots." They went out into the storm. The lantern would not stay lit. Mabel gave up on it after the third try. They ran up the slope in the dark, Winona holding her mother's hand, Coley a black shape moving ahead of them, and when they got to the shed they saw it. The wind had torn back a corner of the roof. The cedar shakes were peeling up like the pages of a wet book. A section 8 feet across was already gone, and if the wind held for another hour the whole east end would go, and if the whole east end went, then the racks would be exposed. And if the racks were exposed, then 200 pounds of half-dried plums and pears would be ruined before dawn. Mabel did not stop to think. "The tarp," she said, "in the lean-to behind Bramble's stall. Go." Winona ran. The wind almost knocked her over. She did not fall. She came back with the canvas tarp, dragging it like a body, and Mabel was already climbing up the outside wall of the shed with a hammer clenched between her teeth and a mouthful of nails. She got up on the roof. The wind hit her like a slap. "Mama, send it up." Winona could not throw the tarp up to her mother. The tarp weighed more than she did. She looped it over her shoulder and started climbing the ladder Mabel had left leaning against the wall. "No!" But Winona was already coming up. Mabel grabbed the corner of the tarp when it came within reach. She pulled it up hand over hand while her daughter fed it to her from below. She spread it across the torn roof section. She hammered, she hammered, she hammered. The wind tore at the tarp and tried to lift it. Mabel put her whole weight on the corners while she drove nails. The nails went sideways. She straightened them, she drove them again. Coley stood at the base of the ladder barking at the wind. It took an hour. It took an hour, and it felt like a night. When it was done, when the tarp was pinned down at all four corners, and the roof was covered, and the plums and pears were safe, Mabel came down the ladder shaking. Her hands were bleeding, her face was streaked with rain and blood and something that might have been tears but might just have been the storm. Winona was waiting at the bottom. The girl did not say anything. She just put her arms around her mother's waist and pressed her face into her mother's wet coat. They stood there for a long time in the dark. Then Mabel said quietly, "Come on, let's check the racks." They checked the racks. Nothing was lost. 3 men from town rode up the hillside road the next morning. They came up early. The storm had passed. The sun was up. The pine needles were plastered wet across the road and steaming a little in the light. The 3 men were on their way up the ridge to check on the timber cutting crew, and their route took them within sight of the Ashcroft property. They saw the tarp on the shed roof. They saw Mabel Ashcroft up on a ladder taking it down. They saw the 10-year-old girl handing tools up to her mother. They saw the black dog watching from the porch. They did not stop. Cyrus Hollingsworth was one of the 3. Josiah Pembroke was the second. The third was a man named Beauregard Chetwin, who ran the freight office and who did not have much of a role in the story except that he was there and he saw what he saw. Look at that, Beauregard said. Look at what, Josiah said. She's up on the roof. Storm's over. But she's on the roof. Cyrus Hollingsworth did not say anything for a moment. She doesn't know when to stop. Nobody needs that much fruit, Josiah said. Cyrus agreed. The three men rode on. They did not stop to help. Up on the ladder, Mabel Ashcroft did not turn to look at them. She heard the hoofbeats. She heard the voices faintly, though she could not make out the words. She kept prying loose the nails she had driven the night before. Winona below her kept handing tools up. Mama. Yes. Those men just went by. I know. They didn't stop. I know. Winona thought about that for a while. Mama. Yes. Are they the ones who cut down apple trees? Mabel almost laughed. Something like that. Then it doesn't matter. No, baby, it doesn't matter. Winona handed up another nail. Mabel came down off the ladder an hour later. The tarp was folded. The shed was intact. The morning sun was breaking through the last of the storm clouds and hitting the east-facing slope full on, and the wet cedar shakes on the roof were beginning to steam gently in the light. She stood at the base of the ladder and she looked at the shed. She had built it with her own hands in the fall of 1884, 3 years ago. 3 years of drying fruit, 3 years of writing in her ledger, 3 years of being called mad by people who had never spent 1 hour thinking about where their food would come from if the train stopped running. 3 years, and the shed had held through the worst storm in a decade. Then she put a hand on Winona's shoulder. Let's go make breakfast. Yes, Mama. Coley, come. The dog came. They walked down to the cabin together in the wet morning light. The autumn of 1808 came in wet. It rained through September. It rained through October. The mountain passes to the west of Cedar Ridge held more water than the old-timers could remember, and the roads down to Sacramento turned to red mud and stayed that way. The freight wagons came through slower. The rail schedules got a little looser, but the trains still ran. The mercantile still got stocked. Cyrus Hollingsworth still counted his inventory every Friday and reordered every Monday, and life in Cedar Ridge went on the way life in Cedar Ridge had always gone on. Up on the hillside east of town, Mabel Ashcroft finished her 4th year. She weighed the storage cellar in the last week of October. 520 pounds of dried fruit, plus 40 pounds of smoked venison from the Krebs family, plus 20 pounds of salted trout from Cedar Creek, plus 15 pounds of pemmican wrapped in oiled paper, plus root vegetables in the sand bin, plus eggs from the 3 hens in the coop against the north wall of the cabin, plus feed for bramblewood for the hearth oil, for the lamps, salt in the crock honey in the jars. She wrote it all in her ledger. She closed the ledger. She sat at the kitchen table in the light of a single candle, and she looked across at her daughter, who was 11 years old now, and could read the primer without moving her lips. Winona. Yes, Mama. Do you know what tomorrow is? The girl thought. November 1st. That's right. What about it? Mabel was quiet a moment. Then she said, 4 years ago, tomorrow I finished this cabin. Your father was already 6 months gone. I sat right where you are sitting. I looked at that door and I thought, well, I thought a lot of things. Winona waited. I thought, Mabel said finally, that if I did the work, if I just did the work, then someday it would come out right. Has it come out right, Mama? Mabel looked at her daughter across the candle. Ask me next spring. Why next spring? Mabel did not answer that. She only reached across the table and put her red-knuckled hand over her daughter's small one, and she squeezed it once, and she let go. Outside the cabin, the rain had stopped for the first time in a week. The clouds were breaking up over the ridge to the east, and somewhere far to the west, in a railway office in Sacramento, a clerk was penciling in the next scheduled train to Cedar Ridge. That train would run. And after that train, the trains would not run again for a very long time. But nobody in Cedar Ridge knew that yet. They slept well that night. They would need to. The last train came into Cedar Ridge on the 15th of January, 1889. Nobody knew it was the last. That was the thing about last trains. They never announced themselves. They pulled into the depot the same as any other train, steam hissing, whistle blowing, freight cars stacked with flour and coffee and salt pork and bolts of muslin and tins of peaches from Sacramento. The clerk unloaded. Cyrus Hollingsworth signed for his shipment. The locomotive took on water. The engineer waved to a boy on the platform, the whistle blew again, and the train pulled out west into the falling snow. That was on a Tuesday. The next train was scheduled for the 29th. It did not come. Nobody worried on the 29th. Trains ran late. The pass was thick with snow. The last dispatch from Sacramento had mentioned a slide at Blue Canyon. And nothing unusual, nothing to lose sleep over. By the 5th of February, people began to notice. By the 12th, they began to talk. By the 20th, they had stopped talking and started doing arithmetic. Because arithmetic was the language of hunger, and hunger had just walked into Cedar Ridge without knocking. Cyrus Hollingsworth was the first to feel it. He counted his inventory on the morning of February 1st, the way he counted his inventory every Friday: flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, tinned goods, lamp oil. He counted twice. He wrote the numbers in his ledger. Then he sat back on the stool behind the counter and looked at the numbers, and the numbers looked back at him. And for the first time in 20 years of running the mercantile at Cedar Ridge, Cyrus Hollingsworth felt something cold move through his chest. Because the numbers said 3 weeks. 3 weeks of full stock. Maybe 4 if he rationed. Maybe 5 if he rationed hard. And the train was not coming. He knew it was not coming because a man had come through on skis 2 days earlier. A courier out of Sacramento, and the courier had said the pass at Donner was under 30 feet of snow, and the plow engine had frozen on a siding at Blue Canyon, and there was talk, mind you, not confirmed, of a landslide on the trestle over the American River. Talk was not confirmation. Talk was talk. Cyrus told himself this. Cyrus told himself this several times. But he also began very quietly to move certain items from the front of his mercantile to the storeroom in the back, and from the storeroom to the cellar, and from the cellar into a locked room that Cyrus kept a key to and nobody else did. He did not think of it as hoarding. He thought of it as prudence. There is a difference between prudence and hoarding, Cyrus told himself. Prudence is when a merchant sets aside sufficient stock to meet his family's needs. Hoarding is when a merchant deprives his customers. Cyrus was not depriving anyone, yet he was just being prudent. That was on the 1st of February. The tin of peaches came out of Cyrus's mercantile on the 3rd of February. A woman named Delphina Whitcomb bought it. She was thin. She was tired. She had a nursing baby at home and her milk was going. She counted out the money 3 times what a tin of peaches had cost in December. And she said nothing about the price because there was nothing to say. There was 1 tin of peaches. There was 1 price. There were no other tins. She took the peaches home. She opened them. She fed her older children first. 1 spoonful each, and then she took a small spoonful herself and she sat down at the table with the baby in her arms and she began to cry. Her husband came in from the barn and did not know what to say. He said the wrong thing. He said, "Someone told me the widow on the hill has food." Delphina looked up. "What widow?" "Ashcroft, the one with the shed. The mad one. That's what they say." "What kind of food?" "Fruit, dried fruit. Somebody said pounds of it." "How would somebody know that?" "I don't know how somebody would know that." Delphina was quiet. Then she said, "I wouldn't take charity from a woman we called mad." "It wouldn't be charity. We could pay." "With what?" Her husband did not answer. Because they had no money left. Because he had been out of work at the mill for 3 weeks. Because Josiah Pembroke had shut down operations on the 15th of January when the last supply train came in, and it became clear that no more supplies were coming and there was no point in cutting timber that could not be shipped. The Whitcombs had 32 cents in a jar on the mantel. 32 cents was not going to buy fruit from anyone. They did not speak of it again that night. The baby died on the 9th of February. She was 6 months old. She had been failing since the 2nd week of the shutdown, quiet and sleepy and not nursing well, and she slipped away in the small hours of a Tuesday morning while her mother hummed the only lullaby she could remember all the way through. Delphina did not know if she had killed her daughter by not walking up the hill and knocking on a strange widow's door. She did not know. She did not want to know. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time after the baby stopped breathing, and she did not cry because she did not have anything left to cry with. Cyrus Hollingsworth heard about the death the next morning. He was standing behind the counter of his mercantile. His wife Prudence came in from the back with a bowl of coffee grounds she had been drying to reuse. She set them on the counter. She looked at her husband. She opened her mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. The Whitcomb baby died in the night. Cyrus did not look up from his ledger. I heard. Cyrus. I heard Prudence. Prudence stood there for a moment. Then she said, there is a locked room in the cellar. Cyrus looked up. There is a locked room in the cellar, Prudence said again. And you carry the key on a string around your neck. And you did not carry that string around your neck before the 15th of January. The mercantile was very quiet. Cyrus set down his pen. Prudence. Don't. You don't understand. I understand fine. A merchant has to what, Cyrus? A merchant has to what? I am providing for my family. So was Delphinia. Prudence turned and walked back into the storeroom. She did not slam the door. Prudence did not slam doors. She just closed it very carefully, very quietly, and Cyrus stood alone in his empty mercantile and looked down at his ledger and could not read the numbers because his eyes had gone strange and blurred. He put a hand on the string around his neck. The key hung heavy under his shirt. He did not open the locked room. He did not open it that day, and he did not open it the next day, and he did not open it the day after that. Up on the hillside, Mabel Ashcroft was reading the wind. She had not been into town since the 20th of January. She did not need to go. She had everything she needed on her own property, and Winona had been kept home from school since the second week of shutdown because Mabel did not like the look of some of the children the girl came home talking about. Thin children, quiet children. The kind of children Mabel remembered from her own childhood in the valley in the bad winter of 1857. She had not gone into town, but she had been watching. You could see Cedar Ridge from the porch of the cabin. Not clearly, but well enough to see that the smoke from the mill's chimney had stopped rising 3 weeks ago. Well enough to see that fewer lamps were lit at night. Well enough to see that on the mornings when someone rode out of town, they rode slow, and their horses looked ribby even at that distance. She had been watching for 3 weeks. She had also been watching Winona, because Winona had begun quietly to do something Mabel did not like. The girl had begun to eat less, not obviously, not enough that a mother who was not paying attention would have noticed. But Mabel was a mother who was paying attention. She had spent 4 years feeding this child, and she knew what her daughter ate at every meal, and something was off. Winona was taking smaller portions. Winona was pushing food around on her plate. Winona was slipping bits of bread into her apron pocket when she thought her mother was not looking. Mabel let it go for 4 days. On the 5th day, she followed her daughter. Winona left the cabin after breakfast with a small bundle wrapped in a napkin. She took the path down the switchback toward town. She walked past the mercantile without looking at it. She turned left at the church. She walked 3 blocks and stopped at a small cabin at the end of a lane where the pines came close. She knocked on the door. A boy answered. He was about Winona's age, maybe a little younger. His face was the color of skimmed milk, and his eyes were too big for his head. Winona held out the bundle. The boy took it. He said something Mabel could not hear from where she stood behind the pine. Winona shook her head. She said something back. She turned and walked away. The boy stood in the doorway holding the napkin. I was still standing there when Mabel walked past on her way home. She did not stop. She did not speak to him. She walked past the mercantile again. She walked up the switchback. She got home before Winona did, and by the time Winona came in the door with snow on her boots and cold in her cheeks, Mabel was sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. Winona. The girl froze in the doorway. Take off your boots. Winona took off her boots. Come here. Winona came to the table. Sit down. Winona sat down. Mabel closed the ledger. She looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she said very quietly, which boy? Mama? Which boy, Winona? The girl looked down at her hands. Peter Halloran. How long? 2 weeks. How much? Just my morning bread. Sometimes a piece of the pear. Mabel closed her eyes. She sat there with her eyes closed for what felt to Winona like a very long time. Coley came over and put his head on the girl's knee. Winona kept her hands in her lap and did not move. When Mabel opened her eyes, they were wet. Baby? I'm sorry, Mama. Baby, look at me. Winona looked at her mother. You have been giving your food to a hungry child. Yes, Mama. For 2 weeks. Yes, Mama. And you did not tell me. I thought you would say no. Why did you think I would say no? Winona's chin trembled. Because you told me. You told me the shed was for us. You told me it was insurance. You told me we had to keep it because someday, Winona, someday the trains might stop. Winona, the girl stopped. Mabel reached across the table and put both her red-knuckled hands over her daughter's small ones. She held them tightly. She did not let go. Winona Ashcroft. Yes, Mama. Listen to me very carefully. Yes, Mama. I filled that shed for us. That is true. I filled it because my mother taught me, and her mother taught her back to a hill country in Tennessee, where women learn that summer does not last. That is also true. Yes, Mama. Mabel's voice went quieter. It went into a place Winona had never heard it go before. But baby. Yes, Mama. I did not fill that shed to sit and watch children starve. Winona started to cry. She did not cry loud. She just leaked. Fat, slow tears down her cheeks. Coley whined and pushed his head harder into her knee. Mabel came around the table and knelt in front of her daughter and gathered her up. She held the girl against her shoulder. She rocked her a little the way she had rocked her when Winona was 2 years old and had a fever the way she had not rocked her in years. Mama. Yes, baby. Are we going to feed them? Mabel was quiet. She was quiet for a long time. Because there was arithmetic to be done. Because there was a shed that held 520 pounds of dried fruit in a town of 240 souls in a winter that had not yet broken. Mabel was not a saint, but she was not Cyrus Hollingsworth either. She held her daughter and she looked past the girl's shoulder at the shed on the slope above the cabin, and she made her decision the way she had made every other important decision in her life. All at once. And final. Yes, baby, we are going to feed them. All of them. All of them. Winona pulled back and looked at her mother. When? Tomorrow. Mama. Yes. Can I come? Mabel looked at her 11-year-old daughter, at the smudge of a tear streak on her cheek, at the two big eyes that had already seen too much, at the small hands that had been slipping bread into an apron pocket for 2 weeks so a boy she barely knew could stay alive. Winona Ashcroft. Yes, Mama. You will come with me every morning until the trains come back. Yes, Mama. And you will be my right hand. Yes, Mama. Do you understand me? Yes, Mama. Good. Mabel stood up. Now, go tell Bramble. Tell her what? Tell her we ride into town at dawn. Winona went out to the lean-to. Mabel sat down at the table with her ledger and a stub of pencil, and she began to work out how much would go down the hill in the morning and how much would go the morning after that. The pencil moved slowly. The candle burned low. Coley lay under the table and watched her. She sat with Coley on the porch that night. The lantern was inside with Winona, who had finally fallen asleep after 2 cups of chamomile tea and a long silence at the kitchen table. The dog was 13 now. His muzzle had gone white in the last year. His hips were not what they had been. But he still watched everything. He still lay across the doorway at night with his ears turned toward the smallest sound. Mabel sat on the porch with her back against the porch post and Coley pressed against her side. The night was clear, very cold. The stars over the Sierra were the kind of stars that make a person feel very small and very old at the same time. Mabel put one hand on Coley's head. She did not talk to the dog often, but tonight she was tired in a way she had not been tired since Thaddeus died, and the words came up out of her before she thought about them. Well, old boy, Coley leaned harder against her leg. My mother sat like this once. The dog looked up at her. In the winter of '57, bad winter, she sat on the porch of our house in the valley and she looked at the sky just like this. And she said to me, I was 14. She said to me, Mabel, when you know what you have to do, the hardest part is done. The rest is just doing it. Coley was quiet. Mabel was quiet too. Then she said, I never understood what she meant until tonight. She sat there a long time. Then she stood up. Her knees cracked. Come on, old man. Coley got up. They went inside. She banked the fire. She checked on Winona in the loft. She lay down in her bed and pulled the wool blanket up at her chin, and she listened to her daughter breathing above her, and to the dog settling on his rag rug by the door, and to Bramble making a small, contented sound out in the lean-to. She was asleep in 5 minutes. She was up an hour before dawn. The sledge went down the switchback in the gray light of a morning that had not yet decided whether it was going to snow. Bramble knew the road. She had made this trip 1,000 times. Never with this load and never before dawn, But the mare put her feet down where her feet had always gone, and she took her time and she did not slip. The sledge held 100 pounds, 50 pounds of dried apple rings, 20 pounds of dried pear halves, 20 pounds of prunes, 10 pounds of berry cakes in wax paper, all of it neatly packed in cloth sacks Mabel had labeled the night before in her careful round hand. Winona sat on the sledge beside the load. She was wearing her mother's second-best coat over her own because Mabel had insisted, and the sleeves came down to her fingertips. Her cheeks were bright red in the cold. Her eyes were very awake. Coley trotted alongside the sledge with his tail up the way he had done when he was young. They came into town at the end of the switchback. The main street was empty. It was early. Nobody was up yet. A single lamp burned in the church. Smoke rose from perhaps 6 chimneys where there should have been 40. The mercantile was dark. Mabel pulled Bramble up in front of the mercantile. She stopped. She sat on the wagon seat for a long moment, and she looked at the building. At the closed door, at the front window, with its display of things that were no longer for sale. She looked at it. Winona looked at her mother. Mama. Yes. Are we really going to set up here? We are. Won't he be angry? Mabel turned her head very slowly and looked down at her daughter. Winona. Yes, Mama. Let him be angry. She got down off the sledge. She unloaded the board she had brought, 2 long planks and 2 sawhorses. She set up the sawhorses on the wooden sidewalk directly in front of Cyrus Hollingsworth's mercantile. She laid the planks across the sawhorses. She spread a clean white cloth over the planks. And on the clean white cloth, she began to arrange the cloth sacks of dried fruit. Apple rings on the left, pear halves in the middle, prunes on the right, berry cakes stacked in a small pyramid at the front where the light would catch them. She worked slowly. She worked carefully. Winona stood beside her and helped. Coley sat on the sidewalk and watched the street. The sun came up. The first person to come down the street was an old woman named Hepzibah Coulter. She was 73 years old, and she had buried 2 husbands and outlived 4 children, and she was on her way to fetch water from the pump at the end of the block because her own well pump had frozen a week ago. She came around the corner with an empty bucket in each hand. She saw the table. She stopped. She stood in the middle of the street with her buckets, and she stared. Mabel did not say anything. Winona stepped forward. Ma'am, would you like some fruit? Hepzibah Coulter set down her buckets. She walked over to the table very slowly, the way a person walks who is not entirely sure she is not dreaming. She reached out one thin hand and touched a dried pear half with the tip of one finger, and she looked at Winona, and her mouth worked for a moment before any sound came out. How much? No charge, ma'am. How much, child? No charge. Hepzibah Coulter began to cry. She cried standing up in the middle of the street with 2 empty buckets at her feet, and she cried the way old women cry, which is quietly, and Mabel came around the table and put her arm around the old woman's shoulders, and she said, Mrs. Coulter, take a sack. Take 1 of each. Come back tomorrow if you need more. Hepzibah took a sack. She took 1 of each. She held them against her chest like they were babies. She started to say something. She could. She just nodded and nodded and nodded, and she picked up her buckets and she walked away down the street without looking back. She stopped at the corner. She turned around. She looked at Mabel. She said in a voice that was very small and very clear, Bless you, Mrs. Ashcroft. Then she went on. The second person came 10 minutes later. I was a boy. He was thin. His face was the color of skim milk, and his eyes were too big for his head, and Winona knew him instantly. Peter Halloran. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk when he saw the table. He looked at the fruit. He looked at Winona. He did not understand. Winona walked around the table and took his hand. Come on. She led him to the table. She picked up a sack of dried apples. She put it in his arms. Take this home to your mother. I don't have no charge. The boy looked down at the sack. Then he looked up at Mabel. Ma'am. Yes, son. Are you the mad widow? Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, That's what they call me, yes. Peter Halloran hugged the sack of apples against his chest. He said in a voice so small it was almost a whisper, You don't seem mad to me. He turned and he ran. The third person came 15 minutes later. The fourth came 5 minutes after that. By 8 in the morning, there were 9 people at the table. By 9, there were 20. By 10, there was a line down the sidewalk that stretched past the closed mercantile and around the corner past the empty saloon, and Mabel and Winona were working as fast as their hands would move. Coley stood at the end of the table and watched every face that came past. He did not growl at any of them, but he watched. Inside the mercantile behind the counter, Cyrus Hollingsworth stood at the front window with his hand on the string around his neck. The key hung heavy under his shirt. He watched the line down the sidewalk. He watched the widow handing out sacks of fruit to people who had not eaten properly in weeks. He watched the 11-year-old girl beside her working with the calm competence of a grown woman. He watched his own townspeople walking away from that table with food in their arms. And something else too. Something Cyrus could not quite name, but that made his chest hurt to look at. Behind him in the back of the store, his wife Prudence stood in the doorway to the storeroom. She was watching him. She did not speak. She was holding a jar of dried peaches from Cyrus's locked cellar in one hand. She set it very deliberately on the counter. She turned and she walked back into the storeroom. Cyrus Hollingsworth stood alone at his front window with a key around his neck and a jar of peaches on his counter. He put his forehead against the cold glass of the window. He closed his eyes. He did not open the door, not yet. Down at the table, Mabel Ashcroft handed a sack of pear halves to a young mother whose baby was strapped to her chest in a shawl. The baby was awake. Mabel touched one of the baby's small mittened hands with the tip of her finger. The mother whispered, "Thank you." Mabel said, "Come back tomorrow." The mother nodded. She turned to go. She got 2 steps and then she stopped and turned back. "Mrs. Ashcroft." "Yes." "My husband said you were mad." Mabel looked at her. The mother's eyes were wet. "He was wrong." Mabel said very quietly, "Come back tomorrow." The mother went. Winona looked up at her mother. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and from the work. Her eyes were shining. "Mama." "Yes, baby." "How many mornings?" "As many as it takes." The girl nodded. She turned back to the table. She picked up the next sack of fruit and she handed it with both hands to the next person in line. They came down the switchback every morning. Bramble first, then Mabel on the wagon seat, then Winona beside her, then Coley trotting alongside with his old white muzzle held high in the cold air. 20 mornings, then 25, then 30. The sledge went down loaded and it came back empty, and every night Mabel wrote the numbers in her ledger. Pounds distributed, families served. Names checked off the list she had made on the second morning. She checked off the Whitcombs. She checked off the Hallorns. She checked off the Austenbergs, in the Krebs, in the Chetwins, in the Coulters, in the Ellerys, in the Merriweathers, and she checked off the mill workers, whose names she was learning for the first time in 4 years. She checked off everyone, except one house. She had not checked off the Hollingsworths, because the Hollingsworths had not come. Winona noticed on the 3rd day, "Mama." "Yes." "Mrs. Hollingsworth hasn't come." "No." "Should we take some to her house?" Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "No, baby." "Why not?" "Because it isn't a gift if you shove it into someone's hands. It has to be reached for. But if she's hungry, she'll come. When? When she's ready." Winona thought about this. Then she said in that too-old voice she had been using more and more since the first morning, "Mama, is Mr. Hollingsworth hoarding?" Mabel looked at her daughter, Winona. "Yes, Mama." "Some questions you don't need to be the one to answer." "Yes, Mama." "But you can watch." "Yes, Mama." "And you can remember." "Yes, Mama." The girl went back to weighing out a portion of prunes for the widow Halloran. Winona became something during those weeks. The change was small at first. It was small the way growth is small. You did not see it happen. You only saw that it had happened one morning when the girl reached across the table and took the hand of a very old man who was too proud to ask for extra, and she said to him in a voice that did not permit argument, "Mr. Etheridge, your wife needs more than this." The old man's eyes went wet. He did not argue. He took the extra sack. I walked away down the sidewalk with his shoulders a little straighter than they had been when he arrived. Winona did not look at her mother for approval. She had stopped looking at her mother for approval sometime in the 2nd week. She just turned to the next person in line. By the 3rd week, she was keeping the ledger. Mabel had shown her once. Once was all it took. The girl had absorbed the system the way she absorbed everything her mother taught her, And by the fourth day, she was writing entries herself in a careful round hand that was smaller than her mother's but sharper. She wrote down every family. She wrote down every pound. She wrote down notes in the margin that Mabel would not have thought to write. Elderly, alone, baby coming, do not embarrass. Mabel read the margin notes at night by the candle. She did not say anything to Winona about them. She just kept reading. The children of Cedar Ridge had a new name for the girl by the fourth week. They no longer called her the widow's daughter. They called her Miss Winona. She was 11 years old and they called her Miss Winona. Cyrus Hollingsworth came up the switchback on the 10th of March. 28 days into the distributions, 5 days before the train would finally come through. He came on foot. He did not bring his horse. He did not bring his wagon. He did not bring money. He wore his overcoat and his fur hat and the boots he had been wearing for 20 years. And he walked up the switchback in snow that had been packed down hard by weeks of Bramble's hooves and the sledge's runners. And by the time he reached the top of the property, he was breathing hard and his beard was full of frost. He stopped at the fence line. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the lean-to. He looked at the shed on the slope above the cabin, long and narrow with its cedar shake roof. He put one hand on the fence post. He did not go in. He stood there for what a person watching from the cabin porch might have called a long time. Nobody was watching from the cabin porch. Mabel and Winona had already gone down the hill that morning, and Cyrus had passed his own store on his way out of town without looking at the table and without being seen by anyone at it. He had walked out the back way. He had come up the fire road on the north side of the property. He stood at the fence post. He put his other hand on it, and Cyrus Hollingsworth, who had walked into rooms his whole adult life with his chest out and his opinions ready, discovered that his knees were shaking. He forced them still. He opened the gate. He walked up the path to the cabin. Coley had stayed home that morning. The old dog had woken with a stiff hip, and Mabel had told him to rest. He had not been happy about it. He had sighed heavily and settled on the rag rug by the door, and he had watched Mabel and Winona go without him, and he had gone back to sleep with one ear turned toward the road. The ear came up when he heard footsteps. The whole dog came up when he smelled who the footsteps belonged to. He was 13 and his hips were bad, but Coley remembered every scent that had ever come into his life, and he remembered the scent of the red-bearded man from the mercantile who had spoken sharp to his mistress 4 years ago. Coley went to the door. He did not bark. He waited. The footsteps came up onto the porch. They stopped. There was a long silence, then a knock. Coley waited. The knock came again, softer, almost apologetic. Coley made a low sound in his throat. The door opened just enough for Cyrus Hollingsworth to see the dog, and for the dog to see him. Cyrus stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he looked down at the black dog whose muzzle had gone white, and he said, "Is your mistress home?" Coley stared at him. Cyrus swallowed. "I know she isn't." Coley kept staring. "I came up here to wait." Coley considered this for a long moment. Then he did something Mabel would have been very surprised to see. He backed up from the door. He walked stiffly to his rag rug. He lay down. He put his head on his paws, and he watched Cyrus Hollingsworth walk into Mabel Ashcroft's cabin like a man walking into his own confession. Cyrus did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the small, clean table with its ledger closed on it. He looked at the fieldstone hearth with the fire burning low. He looked at the ladder up to the loft where a blue quilt was visible over the edge of a small bed. He looked at the primer on the corner of the table, and the small pair of mittens drying on the mantel, and the row of empty cloth sacks folded neatly beside the door. He stood there for a long time. I was still standing there when Mabel and Winona came back up the hill at midday. Bramble knew there was a stranger in the yard. She snorted at the gate. Mabel looked up. She saw the coat. She saw the hat. She saw the man standing on her porch with the door open behind him, and Coley sitting quietly at his feet, and she did not need to see his face to know who it was. "Winona." "Yes, Mama." "Take Bramble to the lean-to." "Yes, Mama." "Do not come inside until I call you." Winona looked at her mother. "Are you angry, Mama?" Mabel thought about this. "No, baby. I am not angry." "Then what?" Mabel did not answer. She got down off the wagon. She walked up the path to the porch. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and she looked up at Cyrus Hollingsworth, who was standing at the top with his hat in his hands, and she waited. Cyrus did not speak. Mabel did not speak. The wind moved through the pines above the cabin. Coley sat in the doorway and watched them both. Finally, Cyrus said, "Mrs. Ashcroft." Mabel waited. "I did not bring money. I did not ask for money. I did not bring a gift. I did not ask for a gift." Cyrus looked down at his hat. He turned it slowly in his hands. Once. Twice. Then he did something that a man like Cyrus Hollingsworth had not done since he was 7 years old in a schoolyard in Sacramento, and even then he had not really meant it. He got down on his knees. He got down on his knees on the plank porch of the widow. He had refused 4 years ago, and he set his hat down beside him, and he put both his hands on his thighs, and he looked up at Mabel Ashcroft, and his eyes were wet. "Mrs. Ashcroft." "Stand up, Mr. Hollingsworth." "No." "Mr. Hollingsworth." "No, ma'am." Mabel was quiet. Cyrus's voice, when it came out, was rough. "I was wrong about you. I know. I was wrong about your fruit. I know. I was wrong about your daughter and your shed and your everything. I know, Mr. Hollingsworth." Cyrus put one hand up over his eyes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Prudence is hungry." Mabel did not move. "I have not been feeding her from what is in the cellar. I could not. I could not open that door. I don't know why. I don't know why, but I could not." "Mr. Hollingsworth, she has been drinking water with a little salt in it to stop the ache." Mabel closed her eyes. She opened them. She stepped up onto the porch. She walked past Cyrus into the cabin. She did not look at him. She went to the storage cellar behind the cabin. She was gone for perhaps 3 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying a canvas sack. 20 pounds, apples, pears, prunes, 2 berry cakes on top wrapped in wax paper. She set the sack down on the porch beside Cyrus Hollingsworth's hat. "Mr. Hollingsworth." "Yes, ma'am." "Stand up." He stood up. He looked at her. His face was wet. "Mr. Hollingsworth." "Yes, ma'am." "I did not keep this shed full because I was angry with anyone." "No, ma'am." "I kept it because my mother taught me." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand me?" "I do, ma'am." "Good." Mabel bent down. She picked up the sack. She put it in Cyrus Hollingsworth's arms. He took it. He held it against his chest like a man holds a thing he does not deserve. Mabel looked at him for one more moment. Then she said the only other thing she said to him that afternoon. "Your wife is waiting." Cyrus Hollingsworth turned around. He walked down the porch steps. He walked down the path. He walked out the gate. He walked down the switchback with a 20-pound sack of fruit in his arms and his hat pulled low over his eyes, and he did not look back once because if he looked back, he thought he might not be able to keep walking. Coley watched him go. Then the old dog got up stiffly from the rag rug, walked to Mabel, and pressed his white muzzle against her knee. Mabel put her hand on his head. She did not cry. She did not have to. Winona came around the corner of the cabin. "Mama." "Come here, baby." Winona came to her. Mabel put her free arm around her daughter's shoulders, and she pulled her close. The 3 of them stood on the porch, the woman, the girl, the dog, and they watched the small, dark figure of Cyrus Hollingsworth grow smaller on the switchback below them and then disappear into the trees and then be gone. Winona whispered, "Mama." "Yes, baby." "What did you say to him?" "I told him his wife was waiting." Winona was quiet. Then she said, "That was a good thing to say." Mabel looked down at her 11-year-old daughter. "Yes, baby, it was." She did not add, she was thinking, which was it was the only thing I had left to say, because I could have said 100 worse things, except that saying them would have made me smaller. And I am done being smaller. And so are you. She did not say any of that. She just held her daughter tighter. And in the west, past the pines, the sky was breaking open in bands of pale gold. The train came in on the 15th of March. 60 days from the last train that had come into Cedar Ridge before the pass closed. And now here was the locomotive again. Coming up out of the last curve before the depot, steam trailing white against the pines, whistle blowing in 3 long blasts. People came out of their houses. They walked to the depot. They did not run. They walked. Because they had been surviving for 60 days on a widow's dried fruit, and they had the strength to walk to the depot, but not the strength to run. And there is a kind of dignity in walking that a person does not entirely understand until they have been through a winter like the winter of 1889. They stood on the platform. They watched the train pull in. They did not cheer. They just stood and looked, and some of them held their neighbors' hands, and some of them wept quietly. Cyrus was there. He was standing at the edge of the platform. He had walked down from the mercantile with Prudence on his arm, and Prudence was thinner than she had been in January, but she was walking on her own and she was looking up at him every few steps as if to make sure he was still there. He was still there. He was still there in a way he had not been there for 20 years. Mabel and Winona were not at the depot. They were at the table on the sidewalk in front of the mercantile. They were still working because the train had brought supplies, but the supplies would not be distributed for hours yet. And there were still families in Cedar Ridge who needed food today, and Mabel Ashcroft did not stop working just because a locomotive had pulled into a depot. The gathering was called for Sunday. It was held in the church. Every soul in Cedar Ridge came. The pews filled, and then the aisles filled, and then people stood along the walls and along the back and out through the open front doors onto the front steps. The minister said a few words about deliverance. He did not say much. He was a good man. He knew when to stop talking. Then he sat down, and Cyrus Hollingsworth stood up. He walked to the front of the church. His red beard was streaked more heavily with silver than it had been 2 months ago. His shoulders were thinner. His hands were empty. He turned to face the congregation, and he stood there for a long moment, and the church waited. 4 years ago, his voice cracked. He waited. He started again. 4 years ago, a woman came into my store. She was a widow. She had a sample of dried fruit. She asked to set up a table on the sidewalk outside my mercantile. I told her no. He looked at the floor. My store has been empty for 2 months. My shelves have held nothing but dust. And the woman I refused has been feeding your families every morning on the sidewalk in front of my empty store. Somebody in the back began to cry. Cyrus went on. She fed my family too, though I gave her every reason not to, though I hoarded from you, though I stood in the front window of my store and watched her hand out food to your children while I kept the key to my cellar around my own neck. He put his hand up to his throat. The key was gone. I opened that cellar the day I came back from her cabin. What was left in it my wife has been giving away. It was not much. It was not enough. But it was what I had, and I am giving it, and I do not ask for forgiveness because I do not deserve it. He looked at the back of the church. Mabel Ashcroft was standing in her usual place. Winona beside her. Coley was at home with a bone. He had not been up to the walk. Mrs. Ashcroft, I was wrong. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about your fruit. I was wrong about your daughter. And I was wrong about what makes a town. He sat down. He sat down on the front pew beside Prudence, and Prudence took his hand, and she did not let go. Josiah Pembroke stood up next. How was a thin man, careful with his words. He looked at Mabel from the front of the church, and he said only, my wife called your shed unwholesome. My wife has been eating your prunes. She said last night that they tasted like summer, and that she had forgotten what summer tasted like. He sat down. Adelaide Pembroke did not stand, but she was weeping into her handkerchief, and she was nodding, and everyone in the church could see her. Beauregard Chetwynd stood up. He was the man who had ridden past the shed on the morning after the storm in October 1887. I saw you on that roof, Mrs. Ashcroft. His voice was thick. I saw you on that roof, and I saw your child handing you nails, and I rode past. He looked at the floor. I rode past. He sat down. Others stood. Hepzibah Coulter stood up and said only, bless you, child, and she was looking not at Mabel, but at Winona. The mother of Peter Halloran stood up and could not get any words out and had to sit down. The father of the Whitcomb baby stood up and said in a voice that carried all the way to the back, I did not know how to knock on your door. I am sorry. I am sorry I did not know how to knock on your door. His wife took his hand and he sat down. When the last of them had spoken, Mabel Ashcroft stood up. She did not walk to the front. She stood in the back of the church in her usual place, and every head in the room turned. She looked at them. Something in the way she held herself straight-backed, calm, unhurried, made the whole church go quiet in a way it had not been quiet even during the minister's prayer. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said softly, my mother taught me to dry fruit. She waited. Her mother taught her, in a hill country in Tennessee, in a house I have never seen. And her mother taught her and back, as far back as anyone in my family can remember. It is not clever. It is not prophecy. It is a habit. The habit of women who have understood for a very long time that summer does not last. She looked around. I did not fill that shed to prove anything to anyone. I filled it because waste offends me. Every autumn fruit falls from the trees on the ridge above this town, and it rots on the ground because nobody thinks to pick it, and this town trusts its survival to a railroad schedule printed in Sacramento by men who have never spent a winter here. She paused. I do not say this to shame you. I say it because it is true. She looked at the front pew, at Cyrus, at Prudence, at the Pembrokes. I am not angry with any of you. She said it very quietly. It carried anyway. Mockery is the sound people make when they do not understand something. Now you understand, that is all. She turned to her daughter. Winona. The girl looked up. Come here, baby. Winona walked to the back of the church and stood beside her mother. Mabel reached into her coat and took out the small ledger, the one Winona had been keeping. She handed it to her daughter. Read them. Winona looked at her mother. All of them. The girl opened the ledger. She stood in the back of the church at 11 years old and she read the list. She read every family. She read every pound. She read every date. She read for perhaps 20 minutes in a clear, round voice that did not shake, and the congregation sat in absolute silence and listened to a child recite the exact accounting of how their town had been fed. When she finished, she closed the ledger. She looked up at her mother. Mabel put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. She said to the room, this is what I have to give you. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Come the spring we begin. Bring your own baskets. Bring your own children. Bring nothing else. The fruit is on the ridge. The sun is free. The knowledge is simple. No family in Cedar Ridge need ever go hungry again. She paused. If they are willing to do the work. Then she took her daughter's hand. And they walked out of the church together, and the whole congregation stood up as they passed, and nobody said a word. 14 drying sheds went up on the hills around Cedar Ridge that summer. 14. Mabel taught in her own shed on the hillside east of town. She taught the women. She taught some of the men. She taught Adelaide Pembroke, who came up the switchback 3 days a week with a basket on her arm and an expression on her long face that was no longer the expression of a woman who ran the Wednesday quilting circle, but the expression of a woman who was learning. By the end of that summer, Adelaide's dried pears were, in Mabel's professional opinion, equal to her own. Mabel told her so. Adelaide sat down on the porch of the cabin and put her face in her hands and cried. Winona brought her a cup of water. Adelaide looked up at the girl. She said in a voice that was not entirely steady, Your mother is a great woman. Winona said, Yes, ma'am, I know. Cyrus Hollingsworth added a section to his mercantile. It was in the front window. He took the Sacramento tin peaches down. He put up wooden shelves. He stocked them with cloth sacks of dried fruit produced by the women of Cedar Ridge, each sack labeled by hand with the family name of the woman who had dried it. He hung a hand-lettered sign above the shelves. The sign said Cedar Ridge's finest, prepared by our own. He charged a fair price. He paid his suppliers fairly. He told Mabel one afternoon, standing at the counter of his mercantile, that it was the most honest business he had ever conducted. She nodded once. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The years passed. Winona grew up. She was 12. She was 15. She was 18 and courted by a serious young man named Absalom Krebs, whose mother had been one of Mabel's earliest students. She was 20 and married to him. She was 22 with her first daughter in her arms, a small dark-haired girl named Constance. After the great-grandmother, Winona had never met the woman in the hill country of Tennessee. Bramble died in the winter of 1899. Old age. She went in her sleep in the lean-to. Coley followed her 3 months later. He was 17 years old, which is very old for a dog. Winona buried them both under the biggest of the apple trees at the top of the property. She built a small cairn of Sierra granite over each grave. She sat with them for a long time. On the afternoon she finished the second cairn, and when she stood up, she was crying without making any sound. Mabel came up the hill and stood beside her. She did not say anything. She just put her arm around her grown daughter's shoulders, and the two of them looked down at the valley below them, at the town of Cedar Ridge, with its 14 drying sheds and its full mercantile, and its lit lamps and its smoke rising from 40 chimneys. Baby. Yes, Mama. Do you remember what I told you about the apple trees? Yes, Mama. Say it. They just make apples. That's right. Winona was quiet a moment. Then she said, Mama, yes. Coley made apples too. Mabel's mouth did that thing that was not quite a smile. Yes, baby, he did. Mabel Ashcroft lived on that hillside for another 17 years. She dried fruit every autumn until her hands could no longer hold the knife. She turned the operation over to Winona in the fall of 1914. She sat on the porch through the last 2 summers of her life and watched her daughter and her granddaughter's cousins run the shed, the way she had run it since 1884, and every so often she would call out a small correction or a small praise, and Winona would nod and they would keep working. She died in the spring of 1916. She was 79 years old. She was buried on the hillside beside a Douglas fir. Winona had planted the year after Coley died, and the fire had grown up strong and straight, and Winona said at the graveside that she thought her mother would have approved of being buried under something that would still be there in 100 years. The shed stood. The cedar shakes had been replaced twice by then, and the racks had been rebuilt, but the structure was Mabel's, and the families who maintained it followed her methods precisely. Each autumn, when the fruit came ripe, women gathered on that hillside to continue the work. A widow had begun with nothing but grief and knowledge, and the stubborn conviction that summer's bounty should never be wasted. Above the door of the shed, in letters carved by a hand that knew more about fruit than about carpentry, is an inscription. Mabel placed there in 1890, the year after the winter of 60 days. The inscription reads, "Summer forgets. The shed remembers." Her mother Hesper, who had carried the knowledge from Tennessee, would have recognized every word. End of story.